Please welcome Mark Bittman, opinion columnist, The New York Times, food columnist, The New York Times Magazine.
So I'm sort of, I have many roles here. I'm sort of a host, which I'm not, of course, the Times is, but I'm proud to be part of this conference, part of the Times, of course. I'm also sort of the first speaker, although I'm already not, so Jerry and Jill have eloquently said half of what I'm about to say, but see if I can get away with saying it again in a different way. I'm also the official rabble-rouser, so I do want to re-plug the National Food Policy proposal that Michael and Ricardo and Olivier de Schutter and I made earlier this week, and hope that you'll all join us in signing on for that. We're going to have copies of it tomorrow, and we'll be handing them out. So, on to the addressing of how to change the food system and feed the 9 billion, sort of a tall order. Many of the people I know in this room think of little else but how to change the food system. Yet the 9 billion question remains a diversion. You could note the headlines for this conference. The 9 billion thing is a different story than the changing the food system thing, a story that's both easier and more difficult. It's easy to say how to feed the 9 billion, and I'll say it in just a second after I point out that it's not an easy thing to do. The way to feed the 9 billion is simple: eliminate poverty. Because the root issues of hunger are lack of equality and democracy, not lack of food supply. Hunger and malnutrition are not about agriculture, they're about economics. I'm going to start with a definition. I'm going to call Western agriculture, the kind that dominates in the United States, industrial agriculture. It isn't conventional, as it's sometimes called. In terms of feeding people, land use, and commonality, peasant farming is far more conventional. Peasant farming produces more than 2/3 of the world's food. In its reliance on high-tech, fossil fuel, overuse of resources, monocropping, chemicals, industrial ag is in fact completely unconventional. It's downright anomalous. But that the industrial food system needs to be fundamentally changed is a bone of contention, obviously, in this room and in most other places. It all depends on your goals. If you want food that puts eaters, the environment, workers, and animals first, food that's green, fair, affordable, and nutritious, then you want to change the industrial food system because much of what it produces pollutes, sickens, exploits, and robs. If you want to put profits and the so-called free market first, you probably think the biggest problem with the industrial food system is people like me saying things like I just said. But America feeds the world is a lame excuse for continuing the worst of industrial farming, which means abuse of land, water, animals, eaters, labor, just about everything involved. I can't apologize for not being more genteel. There's a war here. I won't apologize then. There's a war here, a war of worldviews and of tactics and of strategy. And for those of us in the food movement, the fact that there is a war, the fact that we're finally able to force powerful industry leaders to listen is a really good thing, because up until recently, we were largely ignored. We're not as powerful as we will be, but we are more powerful than we were. Seemingly little things, the penny a pound won by the Immokalee tomato workers, the passage of the soda tax in Berkeley, the growing number of state food charters and local food policy councils, the improvement in school lunches, the decline of McDonald's and the erosion of soda sales, the leadership of food service workers in the movement to raise the minimum wage, the fact that big ag and big food are now forced to spend millions to stop labeling laws that the public wants because transparency is so inimical to their interests. These are indications that the system is starting to change. Well, what about feeding the 9 billion? That's the question so often asked at high-level conferences like this one. But it's a red herring, and it's such a big red herring that if it were real rather than metaphorical, it would be big enough to go a long way toward solving the problem. But it's the wrong question. There is no we who feed the world. The majority of the world is fed by hundreds of millions of small-scale farmers, some of whom are themselves among the hungry. The rest of the hungry are underpaid or unemployed workers. But boosting yield does nothing for them. Production is not the issue. People who say otherwise are unaware that aside from our own Midwestern breadbasket, there's another breadbasket in Brazil and one in the Argentine Pampas, and those across Europe and Central Asia, in Southern Africa and in Australia, and that a common problem in all of those places is overproduction. Farmers and governments in those places call this the problem of finding markets, and they try to figure out ways to sop up their overproduction. Those ways don't involve transporting that grain and meat to feed the hungry around the world. They involve producing sweeteners like high fructose corn syrup. They involve plastics. They involve biofuel, because the food system is not only about food. But let's look at the problem of world hunger briefly and remember that every topic I touch on here will be discussed in depth and with greater expertise in the next day and a half. Increasingly, it's said that we have two problems when it comes to global diet: hunger and obesity. But you could argue that we have just one problem, and it takes a couple of forms, and that problem is best called malnutrition. Poverty causes malnutrition, and malnutrition causes both hunger and obesity. So obesity and hunger can be seen as two sides of the same coin, and that coin is minted in a place called poverty. There isn't a shortage of food, and there isn't even a shortage of money. There's a shortage of equality. There's malnutrition and obesity and chronic disease because there's poverty, not the other way around. We're asking the wrong questions. We should not be asking, how will we feed the world, as if only we could do that and the fate of humanity depended on us alone. As if that were our job, our mission. We should be asking, how can we help end poverty? That used to be a question you could ask seriously. Even governments asked that question and looked for answers. If you don't believe that it's poverty and not lack of food that causes hunger, try this little exercise. Pick the poorest place you can think of, the Republic of Congo, for example, or that last dirt-poor Caribbean island you went to. Put yourself there. Look at yourself standing there. Are you going to be hungry in one of those places? Undoubtedly not. Not for a minute. And what's the difference between you and the people who actually live there? Not that food isn't available, because believe me, you will find it. It will find you. Not that enough food isn't produced in the world, because you know it is. Not even that the distribution system is bad, which it is, but it'll work well enough to get food there for you. Good food, even. The difference, of course, is money. The difference is the wad of 20s you have in your pocket along with your credit cards. There are no hungry people with money. There is no shortage of food. There isn't a distribution problem. There's an I don't have the land and resources to produce my own food, nor can I afford to buy food problem. When we ask the question, how do we feed the 9 billion, we're forced to think of food shortfalls, as if we have to grow more and more food using higher and higher tech methods, more genetically engineered seeds, an increasing amount of chemicals on far more land with greater resource depletion. All of those moves are problematic, and fortunately, there are other, better options, because there already are enough calories produced to feed everyone just fine. And there's even enough food in the world to feed every animal that goes to market, which means there's enough food in the world to provide the world's wealthy and near wealthy with all the meat they care to eat, pretty much without limit. The problems are money and an unregulated food system that, to the extent it's actually a system, is about making money, not about feeding people. As we've currently constructed it, feeding people is a byproduct of making money. And feeding people well, that's not a concern of food marketers. That's up to the eater. And there are only two ways for the world's hungry to eat better. See to it that they can take care of themselves by growing more and better food, or paying them fair wages so they can buy more and better food. If you can afford to eat well, if you know how to eat well, it's pretty easy. If you can't afford it, you're malnourished. And whether that means hungry or obese, it means you're not eating well. This description applies not only to the 1 billion people in the world who are hungry or starving, but to 3 billion, the malnourished. That's almost half the world. And in the United States, which has the highest percentage of malnourished people by this definition of any developed nation, a rate closer to that of Indonesia than that of Britain, the percentage of malnourished people is more like 2/3. This isn't an accident. There are deliberate actions some of us take to create the bad luck of others. We take their land and displace them. We appropriate their water, energy, and mineral resources. We even produce cash crops for export while reducing them to menial and hungry laborers on their own land. Or, in the United States, we simply underemploy and underpay them. So when the question, how do we feed the world? When the question is, how do we feed the world? The answer is, eliminate poverty. Claiming that upping yield will feed the poor is like saying producing more cars or private jets would guarantee that everyone had one. Right now, the half of the planet with money eats well, while everyone else scrambles to eat as cheaply as possible. And as increasing numbers of people can afford to eat well, food for the poor becomes scarcer because demand for resource-hungry animal products surges. Poor people are actually in competition with industrially produced animals for food. A global population growth of less than 30% is projected to double the demand for animal products. But there isn't the land, water, or fertilizer, let alone the healthcare funding, for the world to consume Western levels of meat. Which brings us to changing the food system. We can end the malnutrition of those who can afford to eat, and we can also do a better job than industrial farming does at preserving the Earth's health and productivity if we recognize that the industrial model of food production and its accompanying disease-producing diet is neither inevitable nor desirable. I have dozens of friends and colleagues who say things like, I don't like industrial agriculture, but how we feed the poor. Let's recognize there are an infinite number of ways of raising food, even if we only think of two food systems, the one industrial and the other small landholders or peasants. The probably best method of farming for most people is the latter with some of the scientific knowledge of the former. The probably best method of farming for the rest of us is, for now, a form of industrial farming made more intelligent and less rapacious by being informed by A, the knowledge gleaned from people who still have a real relationship with the land, and B, a focus on the goals not of yield but of quality, or should I say of qualities, the qualities I mentioned before, that food must be green, fair, healthy, and affordable. Peasant food is often all of these, but it's also often so small scale that little of it gets sold. That's the point. It's real food for real people to eat. Industrial farming is usually neither fair, healthy, or green, though it is affordable to some. And it's so large scale and specific that the farmer rarely eats any of it directly. The peasant system is not only here for good, it's also more efficient than the industrial model. The industrial food chain uses 70% of the world's agricultural resources to provide 30% of the world's food. Peasants produce the remaining 70% of the world's food using only 30% of the resources. In fact, if you define productivity not as tons per acre or yield, but as the number of people fed per that same area, you find that the United States ranks behind both China and India, and indeed the world average, and roughly the same as Bangladesh, because so much of what we grow goes to animals and biofuels. It's true that improved varieties of any major commercial monoculture crop will produce more per acre than peasant-bred varieties of the same crop. But by diversifying crops, mixing plants and animals, planting fruit and other trees in and around fields, small landholders can produce more food and more kinds of food with fewer resources and lower transportation costs and a lower carbon footprint. They can do this while providing greater food security, maintaining greater biodiversity, and even better withstanding the effects of climate change. And the best thing is that these techniques, crop rotation, for example, or the restoration of prairie and other indigenous habitats, have been demonstrated repeatedly and in different ways to be effective even on large-scale farms, even on those in Iowa, the ground zero of industrial agriculture. And all of this without the level of subsidies granted to industrial ag in the US and EU over the last half century, subsidies that industrial agriculture needs to be propped up. And all of this despite the efforts of big ag to become even more politically and territorially dominant as US, European, Chinese, and Japanese agribusinesses colonize land and water in Africa and Brazil with the feed the world can't. That's one way of ghettoizing the externalities elsewhere and exporting the grain and meat to themselves. It's not news that the poor need money and justice. If there's a bright side here, indeed, it's that it might be easier to make the changes required to fix the problems created by industrial agriculture than those created by inequality. In other words, we can make a better functioning food system while we're working out figuring the inequality thing. If we drop the exclusive focus on yields, we can use fewer chemicals, which are becoming less effective anyway. If we spend our research dollars looking at how we can farm smarter, and I'm talking about using the intelligence of experienced farmers in addition to that of chemists and bioengineers, we'll get results that will provide people with better food and less environmental damage. If equal resources were put into reducing waste, into questioning the value of animal products, into reducing overconsumption, and actively promoting saner, less energy-hungry alternatives, and if we grant that peasants have the right to farm their own traditional land holdings for their own well-being, we could not only ensure that people could feed themselves, but we could reduce agriculture's contribution to greenhouse gases, chronic disease, and energy depletion. This isn't about primitive or organic versus modern. It's about economic self-determination and sovereignty, the things we want for ourselves and the things we should want for farmers. It's about supporting systems in which producers make decisions based on their knowledge and experience of their farms and the landscape, as opposed to depending exclusively on buying standardized technological fixes. Some people call this knowledge-based rather than energy-based agriculture, but obviously it takes plenty of energy. And as that happens, much of that energy is human, which can be a good thing. When you drive through Iowa or other Midwestern states, you see mile after mile of food that's being grown to feed animals at a conversion ratio of 5-to-1 at best, 10-to-1 at worst. You see almost nothing that resembles food that we actually eat. Poor people, as I said, are competing with industrially produced animals for food. Domesticated animals were initially useful because they could convert roughage to food on land that wasn't suitable for production of other food. Now, we use our best land to produce animal feed, which takes it out of production for human food. That monocropping harms the land and everything around it. And then we proceed to eat too much of the meat we so produce and die prematurely. That's neither knowledge-based nor people-based agriculture. All kinds of questions and all kinds of theories are needed if we're going to produce healthful food sustainably. Supporting or at least not obstructing peasant farming is one key factor, but the other key is reining in Western-style monoculture and the standard American diet it supports. But if the standard American diet represents the low point of eating, one question is whether the developing world, as it hurtles towards that nutritional nadir, the polar opposite of hunger but almost as deadly, can see its destructive nature and pull out of the dive before its health and natural resource base crash. Because solving hunger by driving people into cities to take low-paying jobs so they can buy burgers and fries is hardly a desirable outcome. There's plenty of food. Too much of it is going to feed animals. Too much of it is being converted to fuel, and far too much of it is being wasted. We don't have to increase yield to address any of those issues. We just have to grow food more smartly than with the brute force of industrial methods, and we need to lift 1 billion people out of poverty. The slogan should not be, "Let's feed the world," but "Let's end poverty." That may not be profitable, but this isn't about the business of agriculture. It's about justice and political power. Thank you.